Welcome to a brand new episode of IDTALK4EDLIVE Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Sarfo-Mensah. If this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, we welcome you. We hope that you return for some future episodes and new content. And if you're a returning viewer or listener of the podcast, we welcome you back, and we hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and insightful. So before we get to our main event, I ask for those who are watching on YouTube to hit that subscribe button if you love what you're watching, and to also get notifications of new episodes of the podcast and other content that we put up on the channel. So make sure you press that subscribe button to get some more content and some details. Thank you kindly. So let's talk about today's episode. And this is one that I am thoroughly excited about because it's not too often that we get to talk about education and just the state of where we are in this profession within the context of Indigenous culture. We've had, a previous episode where we really dug in to what settler colonialism is and how that looks in the K-12 context. But today we want to go a step further and talk about some of the problematic children's literature that we find in our classroom libraries. And today's episode is going to be one where we focus on Indigenous children's books that we sometimes, with the best of intentions, present to our children, but in the process, we're providing misinformation about the experiences of the different Indigenous tribes that are represented in those books. So we're going to go deeper into that, and I'm excited to have our guest tonight, who is a scholar when it comes to this subject matter, and she is someone who I know is going to provide some insight as to what we should be looking for and really how this trend has evolved over the years. So, without further ado, I want to bring on Dr. Debbie Reese to talk with us, and we're going to have a good time. So let's get into it.
Hello.
Hello. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Looking out my window here. We're ready for some conversation.
There we go. I am excited to have you. I've actually been, following AICL for, a minute, and I just love your commentary on the different books and your publications. So it's an honor to have you on the podcast.
Well, I'm glad to be here. And AICL is American Indians in Children's Literature. That's a blog that I started, I guess soon after I became an assistant professor. Can I just go ahead and just talk?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
It's a blog. At the time that I started it, I was newly hired as an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, which is a Research One school. And when you're at one of those schools, you're supposed to write all these book chapters and all these articles that get published in these highfalutin kind of journals. I came to my work in graduate school after having been a school teacher, a poor school teacher, because teachers don't make much money. And in order to access the kinds of books and articles that I was writing as an assistant professor, you had to join these professional associations like the National Council of Teachers of English. And when I was teaching, I didn't have the pocket money to do that. So I realized very quickly that a lot of the research and work and writing that I was doing was not accessible to teachers and librarians and parents. So I started this blog. That was, I guess, a little over 15 years ago, and I'm still working on it. More some days than others. But anyway, I don't mean to ramble, but AICL is American Indians in Children's Literature. It's a blog, but it's so much more than that. It's 15 years of resources and writing and critique and analysis, some of it very in-depth, of those classics that teachers use in their classrooms. And I don't want them to use those books in their classrooms. And they call me a censor, and go ahead. But you're a teacher. You have to make choices that are educationally sound. Don't be going around miseducating kids. You're a teacher. So
yes, and we definitely have to do our research. And thank you for clarifying what AICL is, because it is more than a blog. In many ways, it's a university. So if you're somebody who has no foundation as to what Indigenous children's literature should look like, it's the place to go. And I can say that just from experience, from reading the blogs, the different publications there, some of the visual media that's also on the website. It's definitely a resource that every teacher should tap into. So let's talk more about these books, some of these problematic books that we find in our classroom libraries. So you've written a lot of different publications around this issue, some of the stereotypes that we see in books, also the retelling of these Indigenous stories. Obviously, I don't want to say that because we have different tribes and they have their different stories and their own narratives. So I want to make sure that we clarify that the community is not a monolith. That's always something that we want to make sure we do. But with those stories that we do find being presented, what are some of those common stereotypes that you've seen across the board with the stories? And what are some specific factors that educators should consider when they're choosing these books for their libraries?
There's lots of pieces to your question. So what I missed, please come back to it, okay?
No problem.
When I came to graduate school, I wanted to study family literacy. I had been a school teacher. I had lots of children's books in my classroom. I read them to my students, and then I read them to my daughter. And so I kind of wanted to study that concept, the family literacy. You know, you go to graduate school, you're supposed to come up with this like field that you're going to become the expert in. And so I thought, okay, I like books. I like families. I like reading. So family literacy, that will be it. But I got here, and in graduate seminars, you usually go around the room and introduce yourself and what you're studying and where you're from and all that good stuff. And I found when we got here that there was a mascot. There was this mascot called Chief Owingeh that was a stereotype of what they imagined to be a Native person. It had a big feathered headdress and fringed buckskin, and it stood in very stereotypical ways, you know, like with the arms like this, or they're raised to the sky. Very, very stereotypical qualities to the behaviors and movements of that mascot, but also just its appearance. So graduate seminars starting, introducing myself, and when I would say that I was Native, it was like eyeballs go right to me. Oh, she's a real Indian. And so right, and so the question was, what do you think about the mascot? And it was really people who were looking for affirmation of the mascot, and I said, yeah, it's a stereotype. It's not good. And I also found that packed around those early things were invitations to come to a local civics group or a family community group or another class in the university where they wanted me to come and dance for them. And I'm like, yeah, no, Native people, us in particular, Pueblo people, our dance is like prayer in motion. So at home, we dance for certain reasons or certain times of the year. We don't just go and dance wherever we want to. It's not a performance. And they said, oh, okay. Could hear the disappointment. And then it was, well, can you come and tell us stories? And I say, I'm not a storyteller. I am a teacher, though, and I'd love to come and tell you about some Pueblo history and about what I'm learning about children's books. And it was always a polite, no, thank you. It was fascinating to me. They didn't want me, the person with lived experience that could inform what they were doing or interrupt what they were doing. They wanted someone who was going to come and perform for them in the way they expected a Native person to live and be. And it was so fierce. That grip was so tight. And I was really taken aback by how firmly that mascot was held by people at a Research One university who are supposedly the smartest people on the planet. And that was just astonishing. So I thought, what is going on? How did this happen? How did all these people grow up to be like this? And so I thought, okay, well, I still want to look at children's books. And so I started looking at images of Native people in children's books. And I saw them in books that we hold dear as a society, characters who we hold dear in American society, in United States society, that we hold dear, like Clifford the Big Red Dog. Now, I say Clifford, and everybody goes, oh, yeah, Clifford.
My son loves Clifford, too.
You know it, right? I did, too. I remember when I was a teacher, I would dress up like Clifford on some days, for story time with the kids. And it was a problem when I came to Clifford's Halloween, because in Clifford's Halloween, good old Clifford, normally happy-go-lucky Clifford, Emily Elizabeth wants him to be an Indian. So he's like, so she's got this a sheet on him to be like his robe. And he's got a big feathered headdress on. And he has paint on his doggy cheeks. And his normally happy, big, round eyes are now stern and like this. And he's got his eyebrows do this jaggedy thing. Excuse me. And And he's got his hand up like he's going to, his paw up like he's going to say how, and he's got a pipe in his mouth. So it packed in all those images that I was learning were very recurrent in children's books. And I found a similar kind of thing in Berenstain Bears Go to Camp. We all know Berenstain Bears. You know,
Berenstain Bears.
Right?
Yeah.
These are the books you get.
Classics.
Parents give them to you, and you know, parents love you. They're not going to do bad things to you, really. You know, we have a lot of trust, implicit trust in the things that are given to us by those who care for us. And so parents are handing these books to kids in the Berenstain Bears Go to Camp, going to camp, summer camp. It's a big deal in the United States. Kids do that all the time. And at many of these camps, they do these activities that are actually playing Indian in some way. And in this Berenstain Bears Go to Camp, Grizzly Bob is dressed up at a campfire. He's got that same kind of big headdress and fringe stuff on, and he's got his hands up and he's telling a story. My shift in what I was going to study was based on what I found that was happening on this campus with respect to Native people. We are being ignored. At the time, there had already been many years of activism around the mascot, and those people that were doing that were also being dismissed and ignored and ridiculed and mocked for their objections, for their efforts to try to educate the community about that. My intervention, I thought, as a teacher, as someone who believes in the power of image and children's books and storytelling, was let's look at the books. And that's what launched that research area for me. And that's what I've been doing. And I found it's not just in picture books that you get at Kmart or Walmart or your mom or dad gives to you. It's in those books when you get to school and your teachers hand you those books or read them to you at story time. The stereotypes are in those ones too. Those ones that carry the stamp of an educator. They're in those books too. And it just continues. They dovetail so nicely in American or US society from the board books to the picture books to the chapter books to the history books to the literature textbooks. It's kind of a seamless misrepresentation. So I started studying that, and it was all rooted in that stereotypical mascot. Started there, and there were some things I knew coming in. I knew that I was raised to respect our tribal ways, and that there were things that we don't talk about. We go into spiritual and ceremonial spaces, and our elders tell us, you know, you don't talk about that. You know, don't go tell your teacher. You know, that particular phrase, "Don't go tell your teacher," resonates and stays in my mind because it was said so many times by our elders. And that was because we have this history of white folks coming into our communities and taking and misrepresenting. And the consequence of that was that people saw us as pagan, heathen, devil worshippers. They didn't understand what they were seeing. And that led to policies by the United States government to stop us from doing those things, to prevent us from doing our dances. And this is not just recent. Goes all the way back to the 1600s. It's a long history of that. And all of that is in children's books. So we have these white people who went out and gathered Native stories and then put them in these volumes that end up being resources for not teachers, but resources for people who want to write children's books and retell Native stories. And so their source is flawed. And then they bring in a modern day sensibility to that. And that's another flaw. And so there's layer upon layer of the problematic content, and it has consequences for Native people. Like for some, there's one called Arrow to the Sun that won the Caldecott Medal when it came out in 1970s. Every teacher in the country probably has a classroom copy of that. It's absolutely in every library. It was written by a white man named Gerald McDermott who had no idea what he's talking about. And when you open that, it's a Pueblo story. It's supposed to be a Pueblo story. When you read that, he has our place of worship being a scary place. So a Pueblo kid who's reading that book says, but that's not scary. Our kivas aren't scary. And so that Native child in that classroom suddenly has their teacher doing a thing to them that's a harmful thing. That kid knows that's a misrepresentation, but what do they do with that? Their teacher said that to him. Native peoples are taught to respect the adults in their lives. And so here we have these moments, and this is just one example of these moments when Native kids in classrooms in the United States find themselves in this moment when their teacher is giving them something that's wrong, and they know it's wrong. The rest of the kids, it's cool. They don't know it's wrong, and so they just take it in as though it's actually accurate and reliable. But that Native kid is in this space where they can't function. Their teacher's telling them something that they know is wrong. Oh, it's time for spelling test. And everybody's doing their spelling test. And Native kid is like, but teacher said, but teacher said. And so Native kids disengage, they drop out, they don't do well, and it's no surprise. The consequences are tremendous.
Whew. And you said a whole lot.
I did. Sorry.
But it's great. No, this is great because this is what people need to hear. But I want to dig deeper into the retelling of Indigenous stories.
Okay.
And I want to bring up settler nativism for a second. And the reason why is because a while back, I read a publication titled "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor" by Dr. Eve Tuck and Dr. K. Wayne Yang. Very good resource, something that people should read because it pretty much talks about the performative actions that happen, which are called settler moves of innocence to innocence, that happen within Indigenous culture that we just tend to overlook. But with settler nativism, more interesting than that because you have a lot of folks who claim proximity to an Indigenous tribe because of ancestry or because, all right, I took a DNA test and I realized that, I'm this percentage, maybe, Pueblo or Cherokee, whatever my tribe is. So therefore, I have a claim to this heritage. But at the same time, they don't want to acknowledge their roles as settler colonizers. We're still on unceded land. We still have privilege as settler colonizers, but yet we want to claim this heritage to, an Indigenous tribe because, we have a grandmother or great grandmother that has roots or ancestry there. So I'm interested in knowing, do you believe that has a role in these retelling of Indigenous stories, this proximity to Indigenous culture?
Yes, it's a problem. It's definitely a problem because people who are raised with their community. Now, I'm living in Champaign-Urbana still. I'm still here. I go home all the time. My family's there at Nambé Pueblo on the reservation in New Mexico. We go there all the time. I take my daughter. We have an accountability to our elders, to our history, to those who fought for us to have what we have today, which is we are a sovereign nation. And as a sovereign nation, we have ways in place to protect our stories, like those elders telling me, don't go tell your teacher. Those are the things you grow up with. When you are disconnected, when you believe that you are Native, that your great grandma was Native, and that's all you have, or you have a DNA test that says, just forget the DNA test. That's really a problem. But this family, this idea that your family had a great-great-grandmother, and so you are Native, a lot of people take that as, okay, now I can speak on these issues. Now I can write these stories. They don't have the lived experience that can direct and guide what they're doing. And without all of that, they are kind of like a white savior. They're doing the same thing. A lot of them will say things like, well, I have to write, white people will say this, and these people who are, I don't know what word to call, what we're talking about, people who are making these claims without having a lived experience or a connection. The stories that they're writing, they're doing the same harm. There's this sense that they feel very righteous and that they're doing a good thing, because if they don't do it, then who's going to do it? These cultures are dying, the languages are dying, the stories are dying. And so there's this savior aspect to what they're doing. It's just doing the same kind of harm that white folks doing those stories. The consequence is the same. It's harmful.
Right. And if the goal is to be gatekeepers for our cultural narratives and our traditions, I'm wondering, are there any book publishers where there is Native representation? Because a big problem is with a lot of our children's book publishers, you don't see a lot of Native representation in terms of people who are making those decisions and vetting these books to ensure that they are culturally appropriate and they are talking about the authentic experiences of, different Native tribes that are being portrayed and presented in these books. So do you feel like more representation within those big book publishers would make a difference? And how can we go about doing that?
Okay. On my website, I talk a lot about the harm done by major publishers, because those are primarily white folks or people who don't have a very strong connection to a Native community are getting published by the major publishers. And So they create these books that are highly problematic, but they have the big budget, so they can, when a publisher has a big budget, they can make bookmarks, they can make all kinds of swag, they can project images of the books at Times Square, of the covers, lots of visibility, but the books are problematic. That's doing harm to everybody. The alternative is publishers who do know what they're doing, and you mostly find that in small publishing houses because they are working more closely with Native people who are part of their communities, and they know what they can and cannot share, and they know what it was like to grow up on those communities, on those reservations, in those places. So small publishers have historically done a better job. Now, I want to say a little bit more about a new development in publishing.
Yes.
That's a heart drum imprint. That's HarperCollins. But before I do that, I want to address a word that you used. You said gatekeepers. And gatekeepers has some kind of negative connotations to it because it does function as like, you, but not you. And it does give a certain person power over what gets in that gate and what doesn't. Gatekeeper, the word is used to dismiss a lot of activism of people who are trying to protect knowledge. And so I don't like that phrase. And I'm thinking about that word because every book that I recommend on my website, I have effectively opened the gate to let them into my website and my space, and then I recommend them to people. So I do function as a gatekeeper in that way. I prefer to think about what I am doing as a protector. If you think about what was going on at Standing Rock, the Native people were at Standing Rock to protect the water, to protect the land from all the exploitation that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Wider society wanted to call them protesters, and they insisted on being called protectors. Those are very different words with very different meanings. And so I think gatekeeper is like that. What I am trying to do with the books that I recommend, the research that I do, is protect the well-being of Native kids of Native nations from being exploited and misrepresented by quote unquote well-meaning. I mean, I hate to say that, well-meaning, but it feels like we're asked to say that all the time. They didn't mean to do that. I said, yeah, I know. When we go into that space of, well, they didn't mean to do that, they had good intentions, and they as white folks had good intentions. What's being asked of me is to give them comfort, give that writer comfort, give the editor comfort, give the people who liked the book comfort, the teacher who's using the book comfort. And that ask means that I agree to throw the Native kid and the well-being of Native kids and their nations under the bus of comfort for white folks. That was a bit of a tangent, but these are all the issues that percolate within my head and heart as I do the work that I'm doing.
No, and I appreciate you for even saying that, because I know when I use the term, I wasn't thinking of it along those terms. I was definitely thinking of it as terms of like, let's preserve these sacred traditions and narratives that we have that are important to our culture, right?
Yeah, right.
But I do hear how gatekeeping can be a negative connotation. I do understand that. So I appreciate you for even giving that explanation.
It's an interesting development, especially on social media. Who put you in charge? It's kind of like this, who made you the gatekeeper? These are attacks on your efforts to do the work that I'm doing, or people that are trying to interrupt the status quo, that appropriation, the exploitation, the misrepresentation. So publishers, those major publishers have a lot of power, got a lot of money. And for years, we have been trying to break down those doors. And in the last few years, Cynthia Leitick-Smith has made it there. She started an imprint with HarperCollins. It's called Heart Drum, and she's publishing Native writers through the Heart Drum imprint. And so I'm one of my current projects on the blog, and I want to launch it any day now, is kind of a milestones, Indigenous milestones in Native children's literature. And it is going to be about Native people and our achievements over time. I'm very careful of that because, the United States loves to say, oh, this was the one and this was the one. And I don't want that to be what the milestones are. These are just things that we need to pay attention to, the development, so that we can keep going in the right places. So anyway, when I'm looking for books by Native writers, historically, there's so few. And then we get to 2018 and 2019 and 2020 and 2021. It's just kind of like an explosion. And by explosion, I mean like there's 10 books. And, that's a lot, and that's not enough. That's nowhere near enough. But it is it is exciting to see the number of people who are being published by HarperCollins, who has the power to make book trailers and throw them up on social media and just bring that light of visibility to these Native writers. So that's exciting. I'm really excited about that.
Oh, that's awesome. That is awesome. And the hope is that other big book publishers will follow the lead of HarperCollins and create that pipeline for Native writers and authors to publish books as well. So we're hoping for that to be a domino effect.
We are. But, I think we touched briefly on what people will find on my website. And so I do talk about books by Native writers, and I do talk about why they're important. Some of those things are that they are about our status as nations of people. One key piece that I try to say whenever I can to teachers and educators is that we were nations before the United States was a nation. These are our homelands. Those treaties that took place going back to the 1600s were between diplomats, leaders of two nations, a Native nation and a European nation, negotiating. And that just like, when you think about that, just that image in your head, then that naked wild Indian that you see in Little House on the Prairie, or that you see in so many places, kind of like, you're chipping away at that. Because you think, okay, so they weren't wild. There was treaties, there was diplomacy. Animals don't do that. These are people with significant social and political skills. I think that that's something that I try to bring in as much as I can, this idea that we were nations of people. We were not primitive. We were not uncivilized. We were different from Europeans, but that didn't make us less than.
Right. And also this idea that, natives, they're roaming across the lands. Like who comes up with that? Like that's no, that's not what happened. Like,
yeah, and there's some other really way interesting ways to think about all of this. So like you see these paintings of those early Europeans coming onto the eastern coast, and they're like all, their robes and their high neck collars and their tights, and you know how they're dressed. They're like heavily clothed.
right.
And you see Native people when they're not heavily clothed. And so you think, oh, well, yeah, they're naked, they're uncivilized. And if you think about how hot and humid the Northeast coast is, you're like, who is the dummy here? You take off the clothes because it's hot. And
Right.
instead of that reality, people think, well, uncivilized. So some of these are just kind of interesting moments to consider and how they have shaped what we think about Native people.
No, absolutely. And now I want to talk to you about something that you've mentioned in some of your lectures too. So Teachers Pay Teachers has had a problematic history with posting racist content, lesson plans, teaching materials that are supposed to speak on the experiences of Black and Native people. They've had an extended history about that. But there was one particular instance where an author who you're familiar with, Canadian author, Jenna K. Dupuis.
Yes.
She had her book, I Am Not a Number, which is really a true story about her grandmother, I believe.
Yes.
When she was in a school.
Right.
Right? It turns out that there was, I believe, a white Teachers Pay Teachers teacher seller who pretty much created some materials around that book and plagiarized some of the content. Once people caught wind of it, Jenny was thinking, like, why? Like, this was my mother's story. And, I felt hurt by that. And, you would too, because you're sharing a piece of your personal narrative to the world. And then for it to be plagiarized in the way that it was, and then for people to capitalize off of it. And of course, we're in a nation where you mentioned earlier, like we don't recognize what's authentic and what isn't sometimes because of the way we've been brought up. So there's some unlearning that has to take place when we get to a certain point. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about educational websites and marketplaces that engage in this activity where they're just posting, instructional materials that they believe are supposed to speak on the experiences of Native people, but in the end are really being more harmful than they are doing good?
Well, I wish they would listen to Native people. I wish they would hire and pay Native people. Their strategy is to say, well, when someone speaks up, then we take stuff down. That should not be the way it is, especially on an educational website. There should be some vetting that takes place before anything goes up. So I really would like to see more monitoring of that, more, well, we're talking about respect for Native writers in what we're talking about with Jenny's book and their stories than is there now. That respect is just not there. And it's like, why is it so easy to steal from Native people and profit from Native people? That's the American dream. Get rich, make money, doesn't matter how. Just do it. And I guess I connect all of that back to that idea that this country is one where people can get ahead, do better than their parents. And how they do that is of less importance than it should be. It's very troubling. Jenny's book is excellent. And I do know her and have spent time with her and deeply respect the work that she does and the story that she shared in I Am Not a Number. It's a boarding school story. It's a residential school story. In the United States, there were boarding schools established by the federal government to kill the Indian and save the man. Canada, people from Canada came down here and modeled the schools that they established on what they saw down here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And this idea of erasing our cultures through government policies, trying to kill our nativeness, was what those schools were all about. Killing that identity, killing that language, killing the existence of the people as a people would open the lands that we held because of treaties. That would all be undone. That would open what we have left as another resource to be exploited by the United States and others who wanted to come and take from us. So those residential and boarding schools are in the news a lot in the last couple of weeks because now Native people have known since the beginning that Native children died at those schools and didn't get home. Native people know that Native kids died at those schools. They just disappeared. They don't know what happened to them. And wider society is now learning that, and they're horrified to learn that there are unmarked graves holding the remains of Native children all across the United States and Canada. Yeah. When I started my graduate work in the 90s, one of the books that came out from Scholastic was in the Dear America series, and it's called My Heart is on the Ground. It's by Anne Rinaldi, and it's a story that she's white, that she wrote as if she was a girl taken from her Lakota homelands and put in Carlisle boarding school. She misrepresented a lot of what that was all about. And at the time when I was reading it and working with a group of 9 women analyzing it, I was especially horrified that when I learned that Anne Rinaldi had gone to the cemetery at Carlisle and seen a headstone, one of the graves in the cemetery, and there was a name on it, Lucy Pretty Eagle. She took that name and turned her into a character in her book. The character in her book, she has a young woman who goes into trances. That's what she says in there. But that they're not really trances. These are part of a training to become a medicine person. A shaman is what she calls it. And at one point, the Lucy Pretty Eagle goes into a trance and they think she died. And so they buried her alive. That disgusted me in so many places in my body because that wasn't an abstract. That was a real person who really did die at that school. Lucy Pretty Eagle, this is tough recounting, but in the last week, the remains of 9 Lakota children were taken from Carlisle to the Lakota homelands and buried on their homelands. You can find the videos of this online because many Native people were recording, documenting it. One of them was Lucy Pretty Eagle. So she is now laid to rest. Well, one question that I have is how could Anne Rinaldi, what in this society is there that made it okay in her mind to do that to an actual human being? It's disheartening and hard to arrive at an answer. I don't have an answer other than they have seen us so many times over and over and over, Native people and Black people as less than, as not human, as more animal-like, as just not like white people. And when you're not like white people, anything can be done to you. I think that we have a long history of dehumanization that has to be undone so that theft of Native story, theft of Native name stops. And it's not just Anne Rinaldi, it was her editor, and it was the reviewers who reviewed her book, and it was the people who gave it a starred review, it was the teachers who were using it in their classrooms. The layers of what has to be undone in how people think about Native and Black people are tremendous.
There's so many layers to this. There are really so many layers. And I'm just thinking about my own experience as a classroom teacher. So I've been in education for 15 years, and I can say that I've never been in a school where I've had a native teacher as a coworker. But then as I've learned more and more, about just native culture, I've realized that, well, why would there be any teachers within the traditional K-12 system when the language is not honored, when the traditions aren't honored, and there's this constant erasure, of the Native community that's still taking place, in our nation. So what I'm wondering is, if we're not able to do it, well, let's suppose that we are able to do it within the K-12 system as currently constructed, just hypothetical. And we do believe that language has to be a part of that curriculum. So all the different dialects and the different languages from the different tribes, they have to be honored because that's part of the identity. That's part of who people are, right? Just like we talk about Spanish and English and this binary thinking that we have, around language. I'm wondering, what, in your opinion, does culturally sustaining pedagogy look and sound like within that context?
I guess it has to start in kindergarten, preschool, where we have teachers that are bringing books by Native writers who have written picture books and board books that feature Native characters in the present day. And they read those books. It's just part of the rotation that they read all year long, rather than confining it to November, which is Native American month. We are Native all year long, and we should be in the classroom and present through the books that our Native writers are writing all year long. I think that's a start for pushing back against that idea that we don't exist anymore, and that this is what we look like. Part of the problem, and this is really guts me to hear writers say these things to me, are that these wonderful books that are written by Native writers, teachers assign them, and the kids think, but those aren't real Indians because they're not wearing feathers and they're not chasing white people and riding a buffalo or a horse and shooting a bow and arrow.
They're not a primitive state.
Right, they're not. Well, that wasn't accurate anyway. But the idea that we have to look a certain way, we really have to undo that, because if kids reject these books, teachers will not use them, and the signal to the publishers is, well, nobody wants those books. The problem is not the books. The problem is what kids come into reading within their mind is those stereotypes. And I don't know what the way is. There's not a single way, but one way is definitely to bring present day stories written by Native writers into the classroom every day from day one. And when there's Native words in them, make sure you know what those words are and how to say them, and normalize all of that. Just have that be part of the daily conversations in the classroom.
Yeah, that's essential. In addition to doing, of course, land acknowledgements, but not just doing a land acknowledgement, but also taking it a step further and saying, okay, we know that this is unceded land, and we know that there was a group of people who used to live here. They're still living here. There are reservations that they're living on. We need to do something that's going to support them financially and other ways to, keep their name alive, and to also let people know that, hey, they're still here.
Yeah. Land acknowledgements are an interesting development. I have written about that on my blog. That's one of the pages that has more hits than any other. But land acknowledgements are interesting because the parts that I know best are that with my colleagues in First Nations, who were really trying to help educators develop land acknowledgements in good ways. But what happened is that they became rote recitation at schools across Canada, and also we're starting to see that same rote recitation in the United States at conferences.
Yes.
I was at a conference today, and I heard that they bring up the paper and they read it, done. They're ready to move on. That's another mascot. That's just a token. When I'm working with teachers, I say that if you're going to do a land acknowledgement, if your school is developing that, or if you hear one, your response to that is, okay, did you say Peoria Nation? That you're on the homelands of the Peoria Nation? All right, is there a children's book by a Peoria writer? So there's a question. And if the answer is no, then your next step is, all right, I'm going to write to Scholastic and ask them, where's the book about the Peoria people? Where's your book by a Peoria writer? I want to buy it. So contacting publishers like Scholastic, and that's the big one for teachers, is, I think, a way that we can bring visibility to what we need yet, because there isn't a book about the Peoria people written by a Peoria writer. So we have to turn those land acknowledgements into something useful. Rote recitation is just another mascot.
Right. And it just gets prescriptive, and we don't want prescriptive.
Action.
Right. Exactly. Like, for instance, there are tribal associations that are associated with the different people, right? We can do donations. We could do a drive where, all right, we're going to raise money towards causes for this association. So there are ways you can do it where it becomes a learning experience for the students.
Yeah, but when you do that, you have to be very careful about these associations, because we have an explosion of fake Indians in individual claims, and they form these 501c3s, and they get a website, and to an uninformed viewer, it looks legitimate. Native people look at it and like, oh, no, not another one. And there have been stories in the major media, in particular, I'm thinking about in Los Angeles. Los Angeles Times had a big story about these Cherokee Nation claims. These were fake tribes in California that were getting a lot of funding because people thought they were legitimate, and they weren't. It was just a hobbyist group that liked to think that they were Cherokee. They believe it with all their heart. That's what makes it even harder. They believe these identities are theirs, and they come together and form these associations, and other uninformed people come and give them support in some way, and it's all just hurtful to Native people, to actual Native people.
Okay, I have a question with regard to that. So I know that you have to be tribally enrolled. You have to have tribal membership to be, I guess, considered official, for lack of a better term.
Well, it depends on the nation, because they're all different.
On the nation.
Yeah.
They're different. Right.
Right.
So how does one know that someone is like legitimately a part of that tribe? Like, what are some indicators that we should be looking for? Donating money, like, because I know that there are people who have the best of intentions. They want to help out, but they don't know, what's real, what's fake.
They
don't have those lenses.
Right. That's really hard, because people get offended. They try to equate that question to be racially discriminatory. That happened here at the University of Illinois when we were starting our scholarship. The dean's office, student services dean, was going to give us money to offer scholarships to Native students. We said we would write the criteria for that, and the dean said, well, how do you know if someone is Native? And everybody in the elevator, we were riding the elevator down from a meeting, everybody said, you just ask for their tribal enrollment card. And if if their tribe doesn't have an enrollment card, then they still know what they're talking about. Just ask them. And he said, well, how are you going to ask people that? That's discriminatory. That's like asking a Black person if they're really Black. And I said, no, it's not. It's not. You're equating cultures. And what we're talking about actually is a political designation as a nation. And so we tried to help him understand that. And the way that we wrote up the materials for that is Native people know that you really don't have nationhood in two different nations. That is just no. You don't do that. You're in one nation or another. Your moms, your dads, your grandmas, whatever, whichever one you are, you're in one. And people who claim that they're enrolled citizens in more than one, and then they start listing them all, and those are tells that it's kind of shaky, sketchy, especially when one of those is Cherokee. That's one of the most widely claimed identities. It's hard. It's not an easy thing, but you have to let go of the idea that you're asking a question about their race, because you're not. You're asking them about their political nationhood. It would be like somebody saying that they are from France and that they're French, and you could ask them, "Oh, are you a citizen of France? Can you vote in the tribal elections in France? Tribal? Can you vote in the elections in France? Could you go back and vote, or do you vote from here? Do you have absentee voting?" If you shift the question away from culture to politics and something as basic as voting, tribal members who are enrolled citizens of their nation can vote in their tribal elections. So voting is something that the nation, the United States, is very much talking about, and maybe that's an entree to that question. Are you a citizen of a nation, and can you vote in their tribal elections? And who did you vote for last time? Because people will say, yeah, I am. And then you say, well, who'd you vote for? And if they can't tell you who they voted for, then yeah. Might be
Right.
possible.
And it takes an informed individual to be able to pose those questions.
Yeah. And you can say, well, I'm learning. I'm learning about that. There's a lot of these, what they're calling pretendians and wannabes. You're not one of those, are you? And no, I'm enrolled. Okay, you're enrolled. So you like voted at your tribal elections? Like, I think owning our own ignorance about some of that is a way to also have that conversation, and then hear it. I guess listen carefully.
Yeah, for sure. So I have one last question before we get to the lightning round. So looking at the state of children's literature, where do you see it going from here within the context of native books being published to the masses? Where do you see it from here, the future?
I see it growing. I see it growing because of the work that Cynthia Lytix-Smith is doing at HarperCollins. But I see it growing also because of, there's other publishers that are doing really good things like this. This is Cherise. How do I move this so you can see it? Cherise's
Sharice
big voice.
Davis,
Yes.
the politician.
Yes, and
Yeah.
she's Ho Chunk, and this is her story. It's a picture book, and it is from HarperCollins too. So it's not part of the Heart Drum imprint. This is outside of Heart Drum, but it's exactly what we need to see. So I'm excited because I think that the larger publishing commitment from HarperCollins is getting noticed, and that is only good for all of us, because people will say, okay, well, what's HarperCollins doing? Like you said earlier, it can be a model for other publishing houses to
Right.
use. Yeah, so I'm excited about the trajectory. The numbers are growing. Teachers have to buy them. Teachers have to read them. Teachers have to use them. And teachers have to just stop using the problematic books. They really have to interrupt the stereotypes that kids walk into the classroom holding on to, because those get in the way of them appreciating the books that are by Native writers.
But you know what it is? I think they want to preserve the nostalgia.
They do.
The classics. That's what it is. I mean,
nostalgia something.
Think about some of the books we mentioned earlier in the conversation. We're talking about Clifford the Big Red Dog. Like,
yeah,
we're talking like all these classics, and we had to give them up. But guess what? I had to give up Dr. Seuss.
And it's not all of Dr. Seuss.
It's not all of it.
Dr.
But
Seuss.
it's a portion of it though. But there are certain books within the catalog that you just had to discontinue.
Yeah. You know what? When all that Seuss stuff was breaking, and it was easy for people to say, oh yeah, they can't, they decided not to publish this. Mostly it was about stereotypes of Asian Americans, but there was also stereotypes of Eskimos in some of his books. That never made the news. I mean, the media, that wasn't interesting enough, I guess. I don't know why the media didn't say, well, look at this one. He stereotypes Alaska people.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why that didn't make the news. It was just sidelined, but it was part of what they decided they couldn't continue with.
Yes, but a bright future indeed. Oh, but Dr. Reese, this has been a great conversation. And I thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom and to inform us on some of the problematic things that are out there with regard to just Native culture and within children's literature, because it's something that we need to hear more of in our districts if we're going to really be talking about anti-racism and really being inclusive of different cultures.
Yeah. Yeah.
So lightning round. So this is going to be quick. We want to get people to just learn a little bit more about you and what's happening outside of this important work, because you do need to exercise self-care and maintain sanity when all this craziness is happening. So I want to know, what do you do to exercise self-care these days?
I guess I like to sew. I've always been a sewer. And when the pandemic started, I started sewing masks for the hospital. And so I had my sewing machine out, and I try to make this and try to make that, tailor this and tailor that, So I'm sewing.
Awesome. And is there a book that you're currently reading right now?
I'm currently reading the Dene Reader. It's the first anthology of Dene or Navajo writers. And I'm reading that, enjoying that very much.
Nice. And if you can invite 3 influential figures, dead or alive, to the dinner table, who would they be for you?
I want to talk to my grandma and my tete, which is the Hopi word for grandfather, and my mom's mother, because they all passed before I had enough conversations with them about their childhood and their experiences, in particular at boarding schools. I know what my mom and dad had, but I didn't know what their parents had, and I would like to have that information.
Nice. And then last question, who would you like to see next on this podcast?
I want you to get Eric Gansworth on here. He is Onondaga. He writes for middle grade and young adults and for the adult market. Eric Gansworth grew up on a reservation, writing great books for kids, and that'd be a great guest.
All right. And if you're able to, help me out and bringing them on, that would be awesome, because we definitely want to have more Native representation on this podcast, because we want to make sure those stories are told as well. We can get that perspective. So,
all right. Yeah, I can help you with that.
All right. Sure. Thank you so much. And Dr. Reese, once again, thank you for coming on to the podcast. It's an honor, and I hope that we connect in the future.
Me too. I enjoyed this. Kunta.
All right. Oh, I'm sorry. What does that mean?
It means thank you in Tewa.
How do I say you're welcome back?
Oh, I'd have to look that one up, because I don't want to mispronounce it. And that is part of the reason I want to talk to my grandparents, is because, I'm not fluent. I know some words, but I'm not fluent. And that has to be related to their experiences at boarding school. So that's why I want to talk to them.
Awesome. Thank you again. And I hope you have a great rest of the day.
You too. Take care.
All right. Take care. All right, people. So we're about to wrap up another episode of IDTALK for Educators Live. And as I always tell you, I hope that you have a great day, and good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. We're going to do this again. We're going to do this again another time. All right. Peace out, everybody.